On a winter day in January 1540, Anne of Cleves stood ready to become England's queen, the fourth wife to a king who'd already discarded two wives who didn't fit his ever-changing needs. She was just 24, joining a world far different from her homeland in Cleves, where alliances were built less on power struggles and more on pragmatic survival. Henry VIII, twice her age and fresh from mourning his third wife, Queen Jane Seymour, was set on making a strategic alliance with Anne's family. Yet, from their initial meeting, when a disguised Henry startled her with an embrace as she watched bull baiting from a window, the story didn't unfold as anyone expected. Henry, disappointed with her appearance and blaming Thomas Cromwell for the mismatch, nonetheless married her to uphold political ties. But soon after, Anne was sidelined as he sought an annulment and eyed a new love. Anne's short-lived role as queen has often earned her the title of Henry's lucky queen, as she escaped the tragic fates of her predecessors. But was she truly fortunate? Was her life after the annulment one of contentment and peace? Or was it marked by loneliness, disappointment, and the shadow of being the king's discarded wife? Let's delve into her story and find out if luck was truly on Anne of Cleves' side. Anne of Cleves became Henry VIII's fourth wife on the 6th of January 1540, the Feast of Epiphany, when she married the 48-year-old king in the Queen's Closet at Greenwich Palace. Wife number 3, Queen Jane Seymour, had died on the 24th of October 1537, and after a few months of grieving, Henry had been ready to marry again. As I explained in my video on FAQs about Anne of Cleves, Thomas Cromwell had been keen on an alliance with the Schmalkaldic League to help protect England against both Francis I and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And Anne was related to the Duke of Cleves and John Frederick of Saxony, powerful men in the League. The king didn't want to say yes to marrying Anne without knowing about her and seeing what she looked like, so ambassadors were dispatched to Cleves, and Hans Holbein the Younger was commissioned to paint portraits of Anne and her sister. Holbein's portrait was said to be a good likeness, and ambassadors praised Anne, so Henry decided he'd marry her. Anne's brother William, Duke of Cleves, signed the marriage treaty promising Anne in marriage to Henry VIII on the 4th of September 1539, before sending it to England, where it was ratified and concluded by early October. According to the treaty, the Duke was to give Anne a dowry of 100,000 gold florins, paying 40,000 on the wedding day and the remaining 60,000 within a year. However, as historian Retha Warnick pointed out, in related documents, Henry waived this sum, which her brother could ill afford. The king then arranged with Charles V safe passage for his bride-to-be from Cleves through imperial territories and on to Calais. It was to be an arduous journey for Anne in winter weather. She left Dusseldorf on the 26th of November, reaching Antwerp on the 3rd of December and Bruges on the 7th of December. On the 11th of December, she arrived in Gravelines, just a few miles outside of Calais, where she was met by Lord Lisle, Deputy of the English territory. Her entry into Calais was celebrated by a peal of guns, and she was presented with gifts of money by the mayor and merchants of the staple. Anne was supposed to set sail for England on the 13th of December, but bad weather postponed her departure, and she didn't leave until the morning of the 27th of December. At 5 p.m, she landed at Deal on the Kent coast and was taken to Deal Castle to rest before continuing her journey. By New Year's Day, she'd got to Rochester Castle, and it was there that an excited Henry VIII decided to make a surprise visit. Henry VIII had quite a romantic side, believe it or not, and he decided to follow the chivalric tradition of meeting his future bride in disguise. The idea being that the love between them would be so strong that Anne would see straight through this disguise and recognise her future husband, the king. Apparently, this hadn't worked for Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, but Henry VIII was convinced that their first meeting would be a romantic one. Instead, according to some sources, it was an epic fail. Henry pretended to be a lowly servant with a gift from the king, and according to later accounts, Anne pretty much ignored him, being more interested in watching the bull baiting out of the window. Henry tried to get her attention by pulling her towards him for an embrace, but a shocked Anne did not respond kindly to this. Oh dear. That's the story we all know and love, but actually contemporary sources play it down. Anne didn't recognise him, but she quickly became aware of what was going on and welcomed the king. They then conversed and supped together, and all seemed well. However, according to depositions taken when the king was seeking an annulment of the marriage, when he saw Anne at Rochester, the king thought that she was not like her portraits and descriptions, and he was dismayed. He didn't like her. He didn't want to marry her. And he tried his utmost to get out of it. However, he realised that if he rejected Anne, it would drive her brother, the Duke of Cleves, into the arms of the emperor. He married her on the 6th of January 1540, but the next morning explained to Thomas Cromwell that he'd been unable to consummate the marriage, saying, "Surely, as ye know, I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse. For I felt her belly and her breast, and thereby, as I can judge, she should be no maid. The which struck me so to the heart when I felt them, that I had neither will nor courage to proceed any further on other matters. I have left her as good a maid as I found her." He also discussed the matter with his physicians, explaining that he found her body in such sort disordered and indisposed to excite and provoke any lust in him. In other words, he'd found her so ugly that he just couldn't get it up. Anne seemed to be unaware of a problem, and when her ladies tried to explain to her that getting pregnant required more than sleeping beside the king, Anne said, "When he comes to bed, he kisses me and taketh me by the hand and biddeth me good night, sweetheart, and in the morning kisses me and biddeth me farewell, darling. Is that not enough?" Oh dear. The marriage stayed unconsummated, and Henry VIII soon became attracted to his wife's young maid of honour, Catherine Howard. Cromwell had got rid of a wife successfully before, so Henry VIII tasked him to get him out of this marriage. Unfortunately, to cut a very long story short, Cromwell failed to do that, something his enemies took advantage of, and he ended up being executed on the very day that Henry VIII married wife number 5. By mid-June 1540, Anne was aware of her husband's flirtation with Catherine, but she was reassured by the Cleves ambassador that there was nothing in it. However, on the 25th of June, Anne was sent away from court to Richmond, allegedly due to plague in London, but actually because she needed to be out of the way while her marriage was ended. On the 6th of July 1540, Anne received a visit from a messenger in the middle of the night telling her of her husband's concerns over the marriage and asking for her consent for an investigation into the marriage by a church court, convocation. Anne was understandably worried, and who can blame her? Anne Boleyn had ended up on the scaffold just 4 years earlier when her marriage to the king was investigated. Unsurprisingly, Anne consented to the investigation. The following day, convocation met, and on the 9th of July, they declared that the king and Anne of Cleves were nowise bound by the marriage solemnised between them. The invalidity of the marriage was proven by 3 pieces of evidence. 1, the betrothal between Anne and Francis of Lorraine. 2, Henry's lack of consent to the marriage. And 3, lack of consummation. Henry declared that "I never for love to the woman consented to marry, nor yet, if she brought maidenhead with her, took any from her by true carnal copulation." On the 11th of July, another messenger was sent to Anne to obtain her agreement to the annulment. Apparently, Anne was so upset and frightened that she fainted. A terrified Anne sent a letter to the king confirming that she accepted the annulment of their marriage. She wrote that, "Though the case must needs be hard and sorrowful for the great love she bears to his most noble person, yet, having more regard to God and his truth than to any worldly affection, she accepts the judgment. asks the king to take her as one of his most humble servants, and so to determine of her as she may sometimes have the fruition of his presence. She signed herself, Your Majesty's most humble sister and servant, Anne, daughter of Cleves. The king was relieved. Anne was not going to cause trouble. He wrote to her, addressing her as right dear and right entirely beloved sister, thanking her and informing her that he was appointing her 2 houses, Richmond Palace, and Bletchingley, so that she could be near him and attend court. He assured her that he would speak to her when Parliament ends, so that she could see what a friend you and your friends have of us. He signed off as your loving brother and friend, H.R. Anne sent her thanks to the king, sending him a ring as a token, and a while later she sent him her wedding ring, describing it as the ring delivered unto her at their pretensed marriage, desiring that it might be broken in pieces as a thing which she knew of no force or value. Anne was rewarded for her obedience. Not only did she get Richmond and Bletchingley, she also got a house in Lewes, the lease of Hever Castle, and jewels, plate, hangings and furniture. She was also welcome back at court. It was an amicable split. In ruling on the annulment, Convocation also ruled that the king is at liberty to marry another woman and likewise the Lady Anne free to marry, which was rather lucky really, as Henry already had a bride in the wings. He married Catherine Howard on the 28th of July 1540. Anne's marriage to the king lasted just 6 months, and to many she's the lucky queen, viewing what happened to her as a narrow escape. But what happened to Anne after the annulment? Would she have seen herself as lucky? Well, I don't think she did see herself as lucky. She appears to have accepted the annulment out of fear of the consequences if she didn't, not because she agreed that her marriage was invalid. She still saw herself as Henry's rightful wife and queen. She was still important as the king's sister, but her queen's household was broken up and new servants appointed. As Elizabeth Norton notes, Anne didn't have a choice in who these were, and she was unhappy with the appointment of Wymond Carew, who she viewed as a spy intercepting her mail to and from Cleves, something which she viewed as personal. However, life was generally good for her at Richmond, which was a royal palace. As the king's sister, she was invited to the royal court at Hampton Court Palace for the New Year's celebrations of 1541. She arrived there on the 3rd of January with a retinue, and on arrival sent the king his New Year's gift, which Chapuis described as 2 fine and large horses caparisoned in mauve velvet with trappings and so forth to match. She was shown her lodgings before being taken to the Queen's apartments. Talk about awkward. The former queen visiting her former maid of honour who'd usurped her place as queen. But Anne behaved impeccably. Chapuis recorded the meeting, writing, "Having entered the room, Lady Anne approached the Queen with as much reverence and punctilious ceremony as if she herself were the most insignificant damsel about court, all the time addressing the Queen on her knees, notwithstanding the prayers and entreaties of the latter, who received her most kindly, showing her great favour and courtesy." Then the king entered, bowed to Anne, and then embraced and kissed her. And then they dined together, Anne being placed on a seat near the bottom of the table. Chapuis recorded that Anne seemed unfazed, all the time keeping as good a mien and countenance, and looking as unconcerned as if there had been nothing between them. After they dined together, the king and queen then chatted together before the king retired. Then, incredibly, Anne and Catherine danced together, and then with other partners. The next night was the same, and when the king sent his wife a gift of a ring and 2 little dogs, Catherine passed them on to Anne. More presents on top of the 1,000 ducats she'd received from the king as an annual rent. If Anne held a grudge, she didn't let it show. What a woman! The French ambassador Charles de Marillac believed Anne to be happy with her lot, writing that Anne far from appearing disconsolate, is unusually joyous and takes all the recreation she can in diversity of dress and pastime. Good for her. Anne does appear to have spent the next few months, the rest of Catherine's time as queen, away from court. But oddly, the same month that Catherine's sexual past came to light, a rumour about Anne of Cleves had to be investigated. According to the rumour, while Anne had been visiting the King and Queen at Hampton Court Palace, she'd become pregnant by the King and had been delivered of a fair boy. Several of Anne's household were questioned, and those responsible for the rumours were taken into custody for a while, but then released. However, following Catherine's fall, Anne's brother, the Duke of Cleves, assumed that Henry VIII would take Anne back as his wife, instructing his ambassadors to seek to reconcile the Duke's sister with the King. And Anne moved to be closer to the King in readiness. She was convinced that Catherine's end would see her back at the King's side as his queen. Sadly, Henry wasn't interested. He was heartbroken. In early 1542, before his fifth wife had been executed, the King was having to deal with another Anne of Cleves issue, a book published in France, which, it was claimed, had been written by his ex. It was called The Remonstrance of Anne of Cleves, and as Elizabeth Norton explains in her biography of Anne, the author claimed that Anne was reduced to tears and so overwhelmed with sorrow at the end of her marriage that she was contemplating suicide, but that the law forbade her killing herself. The author, said to be Anne, claimed to be in love with the King still and was finding that she could not live in the world without dying daily in deaths far more cruel than words can describe. Fortunately for Anne, neither the King nor his council believed her to be responsible for the book, but it may well have been true to her feelings. Anne stayed close to court for the rest of 1542 and into 1543, and even visited court in March 1543. Although Anne was to be disappointed at the King's response, he pretty much ignored her, she did become close to the King's eldest daughter, Mary. In July 1543, Henry VIII took a new wife, and it wasn't Anne. It was Catherine Parr, the widowed Lady Latimer. Anne was furious and upset at the news. Chapuis heard that she would rather lose everything in the world and return to her mother than remain longer in England, especially now that she is in despair and much afflicted in consequence of this late marriage of the King with a lady who, besides being inferior to her in beauty, gives no hope whatever of posterity to the King, for she had no children by her first two husbands. This is the first we hear of Anne wanting to return home, but then that's because her hopes for a future with the King had been completely dashed once and for all. But she couldn't return home, for there was war between her brother and the Emperor, a war that was to last years. And then, just weeks later, her mother died. Anne just had to make the most of life in England as the King's sister. She was welcome at court and spent a lot of time there, being treated as a member of the royal family during the King's final years. Sadly, Anne had a worrying time during Edward VI's reign. Henry VIII's generosity had ended, and her former stepson was not going to be as generous. Anne was asked to vacate Bletchingley and then give up Richmond too, followed by Bisham. She spent Edward's reign worrying about her finances and wanting to return to Cleves. But her luck changed when her good friend Mary took the throne from Lady Jane Grey in the summer of 1553. Anne took part in the new Queen's coronation, riding in the first chariot after the Queen in the procession, a place of honour, and dining at the Queen's table with her other stepdaughter Elizabeth at the coronation banquet. Anne was back in royal favour. But Wyatt's rebellion brought an end to that favour. Simon Renard, the imperial ambassador, reported that Mary told him that the Lady of Cleves was of the plot and intrigued with the Duke of Cleves to obtain help for Elizabeth. Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower and then released into house arrest, while Anne seems to have been oblivious to the fact that she was suspected, putting the Queen's distance down to her ideas about who Mary should marry. While Anne wasn't invited back to court, the two women corresponded until Anne's death. But it's sad that Anne had to spend her final years away from court and the stepdaughter she loved so much. Anne spent her last weeks at Chelsea Old Manor, the former home of Catherine Parr, dying there on the 16th of July 1557. She was only in her early 40s. In her will, she left instructions for her jewels to be given to her stepdaughters, Elizabeth and Mary. She was buried at Westminster Abbey on the 4th of August, with Elizabeth, Marchioness of Winchester, acting as the chief mourner. It was the end of a woman who'd been Queen of England for just 6 months, but who'd managed to stay a respected and loved member of the royal family for most of the rest of her life. Anne had been set aside by a king intent on marrying her maid of honour, yet she'd survived. She'd kept her head. She'd been granted property and riches. She'd been known as the king's sister. She'd become so close to the king that it was rumoured she'd had his son. She had good relationships with her stepdaughters. She'd been well respected and loved by her household. She'd been popular with the common people. She'd outlived her ex-husband and all his other wives. She had much to be thankful for. But I'm not sure that Anne did see herself as lucky. Like Catherine of Aragon before her, she'd never stopped believing she was Henry VIII's true wife. He'd humiliated her. He'd broken her heart. He'd terrified her. He'd abandoned her in a country that was foreign to her. And then he'd broken her heart all over again when he chose not to return to her after Catherine Howard's fall. And he'd denied her the chance of having a husband and family. Although convocations stated that she was free to marry again, her marriage to the king had been annulled because of a pre-contract between her and Francis, Duke of Lorraine, a pre-contract that would prevent her from marrying anyone else until Francis's death in 1545. But then, until 1547, Henry's death, Anne would have believed herself truly married to him anyway. Anne had wanted to be married to him, to give him children, to be a good Queen of England, and he'd taken all of that away from her. And she'd spent her life depending on the generosity of others, hadn't she? Depending on royal favour, something that really couldn't be depended on. She'd been vulnerable. And she'd had homes taken away from her. She'd been forced to move to other places. And she became stuck in England away from her family. There was never a good time to return to Cleves, and Anne must have been devastated by the fact that she never saw her mother again after leaving Cleves in 1539. Her plans to return home and live with her mother came to nothing. Although there were many happy times during Henry VIII's reign and the first few months of Mary's reign, Anne spent many years in isolation away from court, being surrounded by rumours, and in what was a foreign country. Anne of Cleves remains a fascinating figure in the story of Henry VIII's queens. By surviving an annulment and avoiding the tragic fate that befell others, she's often seen as the lucky queen who walked away. But Anne's life after her marriage to Henry wasn't entirely one of joy or peace. She watched as another woman filled her place, and she likely struggled with a sense of loss and displacement as her identity shifted from queen to king's sister. Even so, Anne's ability to navigate her difficult position with grace and adaptability speaks to her resilience and, I feel, her pragmatism. History has left us with the image of a survivor, a woman who, against the odds, managed to find a place and a measure of contentment in Henry's perilous world. But I do feel that Anne's lack of control, the challenges she faced, and her inability to remarry, despite being well treated by Henry, made her situation complex. Although she avoided the deadly fates of other queens, her story, in my view, remains tinged with a sense of loss, isolation, and rather limited options. Did Anne feel fortunate? Did she feel that she was Henry's lucky queen? I really don't think so. But what do you think? I'd love to know, so please do comment. Thank you so much for watching, and please comment. Please do like this video if you've enjoyed it. Give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.